Good day. Today, Wednesday, 6th September, we are now well into the fourth month of Ukraine's offensive, and I noticed that the confident talk of a few days ago about Ukrainian breakthroughs, which continued yesterday in the Daily Telegraph, well, as of the time of making of this video, this has somewhat ebbed away. But at least in Britain, and curiously in Russia as well, the main story about Ukraine's offensive, or faltering offensive as some are now describing it, is not the actual events on the battleground, but the destruction of a single tank, a British Challenger 2 tank, which was destroyed along with a number of other vehicles, 2 infantry fighting vehicles and a truck, in what was clearly some kind of an ambush or attack near Rabotino, this endlessly fought over village where there's been so much fighting taking place for so many months now, and about whose current status I will return to shortly. And it's, to my mind, a massive overemphasis on what has happened to one particular tank. We've seen Leopard 2 tanks burning on the steppes. The Germans, by the way, apparently now are intending to supply Ukraine with a further 18 Leopard 2 tanks. We'll come to that shortly, along with 20 Leopard 1s. We haven't yet seen the Leopard 1 on the battlefields. The Ukrainians presumably are holding it back because they doubt its effectiveness. But anyway, what is the story about the Challenger 2? Well, I'm not absolutely sure. It's been massively oversold by the British, or so it seems to me. They've claimed that it's a virtually indestructible tank, just as the Titanic was once upon a time claimed by the British builders to be allegedly an all but unsinkable ship. Anyway, a bit like the Titanic, in the first major battle against a peer adversary, it has turned out otherwise, and it seems that the Challenger 2 is as destroyable as all other tanks are, something which of course nobody could possibly have doubted. There's been some rather interesting comments from some Ukrainian officials, or rather Ukrainian soldiers, that have appeared over the course of the discussions about the Challenger 2. I've read reports that Ukrainian soldiers have spoken about the Challenger 2 as the sniper amongst tanks, that they fire the Challenger 2 from long range, taking advantage of its rifled gun and the accuracy over long ranges that this supposedly gives the Challenger 2. That's plausible, and it might explain, by the way, why there's been less evidence of it on the battlefronts. But anyway, putting all that aside, the Challenger 2 is just a tank. It burns like other tanks too. Perhaps it's a bit more heavily armoured than some. It's also much heavier than most. There's been claims that it excels in cross-country movements over marshy soil. I'm very sceptical about that, by the way, but that's another story. I suspect that being such a big and heavy vehicle, it's probably less mechanically reliable than some other tanks, but I'm not going to judge or assess its qualities. All I'm saying is that perhaps the British devoted too much effort to talking up the qualities of this particular tank, claiming, absurdly in my opinion, that it had never been destroyed by enemy action in any battlefront where it had been deployed. It's just a tank, one tank of many. Lots of tanks have been destroyed over the course of this war, and this is one. So that's all I'm going to say about the Challenger 2. A bit deflating for the British that one of them has been knocked out. The Ukrainians are now down from 14 to 13 of these tanks. Apparently difficult to maintain, but this doesn't change anything fundamental in the nature of the fighting. So where are we in the course of the fighting? Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount today discussing in detail the nature of the fighting that's been taking place over the last 24 hours, because it seems to me that on this occasion this can be discussed quite quickly. Briefly, yesterday, more reports about Ukrainian attacks, that there was another major attempt by Ukraine to break through along the battle lines. And as I was making the program yesterday, reports of strenuous Ukrainian attempts to break through in Rabotino and Verbovoye in the Zaporozhye front. There were attacks in the Vremivka salient area. There was reports that the Ukrainians were making a big attack towards a village called Novodonetsk, which they tried to capture, by the way, on the first day of the offensive on the 4th of June, but which the Russians have been able to hold on to. There was more reports that they've tried to push south from, again in the Vremivka salient area, south from Orozhainove, another village that they'd captured. And last but not least, there were lots of reports about heavy fighting in the Bakhmut area around Klishevka, this village that the Ukrainians have made strenuous attempts to capture ever since they went on the attack in the Bakhmut area back in May. There were even some reports from Russian sources, these are Russian sources, that claimed that the Ukrainians were in control of half of the village of Klishevka and were pushing the Russians out. And then, of course, contradictory reports started to appear that, in fact, the Ukrainian attacks had been broadly repelled and had made only limited gains around the Bakhmut area, and, by the way, everywhere else. At the end of this day of supposedly intense battles, it seems overall that the situation remains exactly as it was before these Ukrainian attacks took place. Fighting in Rabotino, as we will see, has been as inconclusive as always. In fact, there were reports yesterday that the Russian forces had counterattacked in Rabotino and had recaptured much of the south of Rabotino and the central areas of Rabotino. These were troops supposedly drawn from Russia's elite 76th Airborne Guards Division, that they'd attacked Rabotino from two sides. Then earlier today, Yevgeny Belitsky, the acting head of the Zaporozhye regional government, said that the Russian troops had actually pulled out of Rabotino, but that they were still located very close to the village. Then, as we will see, the Russian Defense Ministry published a statement, a report, which seemed to contradict a bit of what Belitsky was saying. I'm not going to get into the details of this. We'll come to what the Russian Defense Ministry says overall shortly. But overall, it seems nothing very much has changed. Novodonetsk remains under Russian control. The attack, attempted crossing of a river near to Orozhanye in the Vremivka salient area, was repelled. According to a Russian report, the Ukrainian troops that tried to advance across the river were caught in a massive fire strike by Russian multiple rocket launch systems, and most of them were killed or wounded, or at least driven back. And of course, in the Bakhmut area, things appear to remain as always. Ukraine has not managed so far, either to capture Klashevka or to make any significant tactical gains. And sure enough, this morning we've had comments about the situation on the Eastern Front lines in the Bakhmut area and other places from General Syrsky, Ukrainian's ground force commander. He's the overall commander of the forces on the Eastern fronts in the Donbass. And he actually published a very pessimistic set of comments about the state of the fighting. He said, and this is on his Telegram channel, the current operational situation on the eastern directions remains complex. And he specified that in the area around Bakhmut, Kupiansk, and Krasny Liman, or Liman, I should say, he said Liman, not Krasny Liman, that's Russians who call this place Krasny Liman. He said that this is where the situation is particularly complex, and he has ordered his forces in these areas to ensure a reliable defense and prevent any loss of current positions. Now, the last is a very interesting set of words because, of course, a couple of weeks ago, not very long ago, General Syrsky was making some very bold claims about the fighting near Bakhmut. He was saying that the Ukrainians had established fire control over Bakhmut. He said that all the conditions had been put in place for the Ukrainians to recapture Bakhmut. Then, of course, he started to become more pessimistic, but things have moved backwards and forwards there. Sometimes he's been more pessimistic, sometimes more optimistic. In my opinion, this is the most pessimistic statement he's made up to this point about the situation in and around Bakhmut. And he's now talking about Ukrainian troops being ordered to ensure a reliable defense and to prevent loss of current positions, which may be a sign that demands from Western partners, from the United States and Britain, to cease offensive operations in Bakhmut are now being heeded. Yesterday, I spoke about how President Zelensky had visited Ukrainian troops in the Bakhmut area. And of course, this came just before this last big attack. Perhaps, just possibly, this was the last Ukrainian attempt to achieve some kind of a breakthrough in the Bakhmut area before going on the defensive. Perhaps General Syrsky's comments support that interpretation. But General Syrsky has said so many inconsistent things over the course of the last few months that, frankly, I wouldn't place an excessive amount of weight on that. But anyway, overall, the picture clearly is of something like a failure to break through on the Bakhmut front, and a situation that is becoming increasingly complicated. And of course, Syrsky is talking in the same way about the situation further north around Kupiansk and Liman. So, not from General Syrsky's perspective, an altogether happy picture in the area that he controls. But what has actually happened at Rabotino, this village, 480 people before the conflict began, fought over with such tremendous intensity over 3 months of, well, more than 3 months of fighting now. Well, yesterday, as I said, reports that Ukrainians had launched an attack towards Verbovoye specifically. That was apparently the main focus of Ukraine's attacks. Then reports that the Russians were counterattacking in Rabotino, a suggestion from the Slavyangrad Telegram channel that the main purpose of the Russian counterattack in Rabotino was to destabilize the Ukrainian attack around towards Verbovoye, and that it wasn't so much intended to recapture the whole of Rabotino, rather to make it difficult for the Ukrainians to press home their attack on Verbovoye. And, well, I'm not going to suggest that the Challenger 2 was destroyed over the course of this fighting around Rabotino, but it does seem that it was destroyed reasonably close to Rabotino. I'm not able to say exactly where. I'm not good with maps, as I've discussed many times. But clearly, fighting in and around this endlessly contested village continues. And then, of course, after the attack on Verbovoye, the Ukrainian attack on Verbovoye was called off. The attempt to advance towards that village ended. Well, we got the further report from BITCHUTE that the Russians had pulled back in the Rabotino area. And then earlier today, perhaps in response to BITCHUTE's points, we had this comment from the Russian Defense Ministry in its latest update about the state of the fighting in and around this area, around Rabotino and Verbovoye. And this is what the Russian Defense Ministry said. In Zaporozhye direction, units of the Russian grouping of troops supported by aviation, artillery and heavy flamethrower systems, these are the TOS-1s, have repelled 4 enemy attacks near Verbovoye and Rabotino. There were no changes in the tactical position of Russian troops. So essentially what the Russians are saying, what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying, that the Russians neither advanced nor retreated. They are essentially back where they were when all this fighting started. So it's not entirely correct what BITCHUTE is saying, that they were pushed out of Rabotino. As I've understood it, the Russians have established their positions just south of the village, but they're able to control, or at least dominate, the area in the southern parts of the village where Ukraine hasn't been able to consolidate. And any attack that did take place within Rabotino was clearly a spoiler attack. It was not intended to recapture the village. Slavyangrad, I suspect, is correct. It was intended to disrupt Ukrainian attacks towards Verbovoye. And by the way, the Russian Defense Ministry again provides us with some information about the intensity of the fighting around Rabotino and Verbovoye. It says that enemy losses were up to 40 Ukrainian servicemen, that's dead and wounded, 1 tank, could that be the Challenger 2? Just asking. 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, 2 US manufactured M777 artillery systems, 3 US manufactured M109 Paladin self-propelled artillery systems, 1 UK manufactured FH-70 gun, 2 Star B howitzers, 2 D-30 guns, 2 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery systems. Notice that if it is the tank, the Russian Defense Ministry is not identifying it as a Challenger 2, and one wonders why. But anyway, just consider what the Russian Ministry of Defense is telling us. It looks as if the number of Ukrainian troops who were killed over the course, or killed or wounded over the course of the fighting in Zaporozhye region, in Rabotino and Verbovoye yesterday was 40. That's what the Russian Defense Ministry claimed. I'm not, as I said, corroborating these figures. I don't know. But 40 dead or wounded, that is significantly less than what the Russians have claimed in other encounter battles. But also consider how much more equipment was destroyed. 1 tank, perhaps that was a Challenger 2. Though it is so, it's strange that the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't tell us. 2 armoured fighting vehicles. Again, they don't tell us of what type, but I did see reports that 2 BMP Soviet-era fighting vehicles were seen destroyed near the Challenger 2, so perhaps these are the vehicles that have been talked about here. 2 pickup trucks, 2 US manufactured M777 artillery systems, 3 US manufactured M109 Paladin self-propelled artillery systems, 1 UK manufactured FH-70 gun, 2 Star B howitzers, 2 D-30 guns, and 2 Gvozdika self-propelled guns. Now, this is interesting because it looks as if the number of soldiers killed in this encountered battle, in what was clearly an encountered battle, was relatively small, but that the Russians are claiming, perhaps accurately, to have destroyed a significant number of armoured vehicles. A tank, perhaps the Challenger 2, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, perhaps the BMPs, 2 trucks, and then 2 M777s, 3 M109 self-propelled guns, 1 FH-70 self-propelled guns, and then 2 Star B howitzers, 2 D-30 guns, and 2 Gvozdika self-propelled guns of the Ukrainian force. So it looks as if what the Russians were up to is that they were launching a strike against Ukrainian artillery systems. And it does seem as if it was a particularly heavy and successful strike. Now, compare that with what the Russians are telling us about the fighting that took place yesterday in Donetsk, in Donbass. And here it's clear that we're talking about fighting in a fairly dispersed area, but we read that the units of the Yug, the South Group of Forces, in cooperation with aviation and artillery, repelled 10 attacks by assault groups of the 80th Airborne Assault, 110th Mechanized and 59th Motorized Infantry Brigades of the Ukrainian military, close to Klesheyevka, Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, this is another village to the north of the former Bakhmut, Nkhimik, Nevelskoye, and Marinka. There's quite a large area in Donbass, and we learned that enemy losses, Ukrainian troops, in this fighting amounted to 285 troops. That's what the Russians are claiming. Again, let me repeat, these are dead and wounded. And there was 1 tank, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 5 motor vehicles, 1 Gvozdika self-propelled gun, 1 Rapira gun, and 1 drone command post. So, much more heavy fighting in the Donbass than in Zaporozhye region, despite all the things that you hear about where the main fighting is taking place. And this is according to the Russian Defense Ministry. And I will conclude by discussing what the Russian Defense Ministry also says about situation elsewhere. They're saying that in the fighting near Urazhalnoye and Novodonetsk, this is in the Vremivka salient area, Ukraine launched intense attacks, and 180 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded. 5 tanks were lost here, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 motor vehicles, 1 Polish-manufactured Krab self-propelled artillery system, 2 Gvozdika self-propelled howitzers, and 1 D-20 howitzer. So it looks as if the biggest attack yesterday took place not again in the Zaporozhye area, but in the Vremivka salient. And, of course, The Russians were on the attack themselves in other places. They say that they have improved their tactical positions near Kupiansk, whatever that means. They say that they've repelled 2 Ukrainian attacks in the area of Kupiansk, but they claim that only 40 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded in fighting around Kupiansk, and in the area of Liman, where Syrsky says that the situation is complicated. In other words, it's deteriorating. There, the Russians claim that 50 Ukrainian troops were killed and wounded. So despite all that one hears, the fighting, the main fighting, continues to happen in central Donbass. That's where the fighting is most intense, in General Syrsky's area of responsibility, not in that of Generals Zaluzhny and Tarnavsky further south, the place where all the emphasis on the offensive is taking place. It's in central Donbass, around Bakhmut and near Donetsk city, that the fighting remains most intense. And to the extent that the Ukrainians tried to achieve some kind of progress yesterday, their main effort was not in this place of Rabotino and Verobovoye, where they're supposed to have achieved this breakthrough. As I've said, I've expressed my own doubts about this. They made a big effort yesterday, or at least a bigger effort yesterday, to advance in the Vremivka salient, and all the reports agree that they made no progress there at all. Now, there was also very heavy Russian missile and drone strikes across Ukraine yesterday. There were reports of Tupolev 95 strategic bombers operating and launching long-range cruise missiles. There were reports of Tupolev 22M3 supersonic bombers also operating. I'm going to say straight away, if there was this major missile attack, cruise missile attack across Ukraine, there's been little information today, as far as I can see, about what it did achieve. But there's been clarification on one particular further point, and it shows that sometimes reports that we get about things that happen are not always fully accurate, because there was reports, including, by the way, on the Russian news agency TASS, that Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers of the Russian Tactical Air Force have now been launching Kinzhal hypersonic missiles against Ukraine. I was a little wary about this story when it appeared, because to my knowledge the whole point about the Kinzhal is that it needs to be launched from very high altitudes at very high speeds, and the only aircraft, tactical aircraft, in the Russian Air Force that is really adapted to doing this is the MiG-31, which is in fact designed to operate at extremely high speeds and very high altitudes, and has therefore become the major launch platform of the Kinzhal missile. Well, it turned out that the reports that the Sukhoi 34 was operating with Kinzhal missiles was in fact wrong. The Sukhoi 34s have now been adapted to launch a new weapon system, but it is not the Kinzhal. It is the 1,500 kilogram guided bomb that has now been developed by the Russian defense industry. There's been pictures of the enormous size of this particular bomb. It can be apparently launched over significant distances, and apparently it's extremely difficult to intercept. And a bomb which weighs 1.5 tons is going to cause massive damage on any structure that it targets. And again, I wonder which structures the Russians might have in mind to use with this particular bomb. Could it be, for example, the bridges across the Dnieper, which the Ukrainians have been using to sustain their forces in Donbass and Zaporozhye on the east bank of the Dnieper? If the Russians were to destroy all the Dnieper bridges, the Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper would be in effect marooned. But I've discussed in many programs the difficulties of destroying these big, strong bridges across the Dnieper, though I've also said that, in my opinion, the Russians do have the technology and the capability to do this if they put their mind to it. Now, I say all of that. I'm not going to anticipate what the Russians are going to do, but I would say that there's been a lot of discussion now about the continuing Russian build-up that is taking place. There's been a very interesting, well, I will call it tweet by an anonymous commentator called Armchair Warrior, whom I don't know anything about, but he's provided some information about the scale of the Russian forces that are now accumulating. He says that at the time when Russia launched its special military operation in February 2022, the ground forces of the Russian army numbered around 350,000 men in total. He says that the Russian build-up that's been taking place ever since is steadily increasing that total to around 650,000, and these are troops that could be deployed on the battlefield. And he says that these troops are going to be being equipped with the full range of weapon systems and armor and tanks and guns and other machines and drones that would be needed to make this into an overwhelmingly powerful and combat effective force. Now, this is what this person said. I'm no means at all of discussing the correctness of those kind of claims, but I did see this interesting article that has appeared by Colonel Kemp, Richard Kemp, in the Daily Telegraph, and he talks about how President Putin, it's always President Putin, is developing a sinister new plan for victory. And of course, when you go and read through the article, it's not clear what makes this plan particularly sinister, though he does talk at very considerable length about Russia importing shells and other munitions from North Korea. I will come to that later, but presumably that's the sinister side of the plan. But in fact, when you unpick it, this isn't the real point of the article. He says that as Kiev's offensive wears on into its fourth month with only limited success and a few Russian counterattacks, it is becoming clear that Moscow's plan may be to allow Ukraine to exhaust its men, tanks, shells and missiles against the Surovikin line's hardest edge. The thinking could be that once Ukraine's Western-equipped and trained maneuver forces have been ground down, Russia will then be able to launch its own major offensive, perhaps as early as January. And then he engages in an awful lot of discussion about discussion that I'm not going to comment about. I suspect it's not really very meaningful, about the German offensive in the First World War in March 1918. He draws all kinds of parallels with that. I don't know how accurate or meaningful those parallels are. I doubt that they are particularly meaningful. But anyway, he talks at inordinate length, in my opinion, about this. But he does say that the Russians have been building up their forces, that he admits that Russia has a greater volume of military-industrial production than much of the West, and continues to mobilize tens of thousands of men each quarter on a rolling basis, even though he claims, without providing any evidence, by the way, that its core supplies remain inadequate for the level of expenditure required for a new major offensive, which is where supposedly North Korea comes in. And he then talks about how the Russians can then, at some point, with the Ukrainian forces ground down, they will be able to go on the offensive themselves. And he says we cannot count on a similar fate to the one that the Germans experienced in 1918, overcoming Putin's next move. It is questionable whether Ukraine will have the resources to hold the Russians back. And if this apocalyptic scenario becomes reality, a monumental effort will be required from the West, as well as from Ukraine, greater than has already been delivered. It will be extremely costly for everyone, with the potential consequences too terrifying to contemplate. Quite a dramatic article in some ways. Richard Kemp, by the way, in my experience, shifts from optimism to pessimism about Ukraine's prospects, depending on what the headlines say. A few days ago, he had bounced back to some degree of optimism about Ukraine's prospects following the reports that Ukraine had breached the Surovikin line. As we see in this article, he's no longer so sure, and he now thinks that in fact the Russians might be grinding the Ukrainians down, and perhaps the Surovikin line hasn't been breached, and he's becoming increasingly concerned about the big Russian offensive that is perhaps looming over the horizon. And of course, we have lots of reports from Russian sources that tell us that this is all correct. Meanwhile, whilst on this topic, I should say that a Russian commander, Abdi Alaudinov, who is, of course, the Chechen forces commander on the Russian side, he's now come and said that the Russians have now destroyed between 60 to 70% of the equipment Ukraine has been supplied from the West. That may be overstating things, but I suspect it's probably closer to some claims I've seen, which apparently originate from the Dutch site, Oryx, that Ukraine has only lost 6 Leopard 2 tanks, which I think is most unlikely. I noticed, by the way, that in its latest military package, as well as the 20 Leopard 1s that Germany has previously supplied to Ukraine, the Germans are now supplying 20 more Leopard 2s, which they've apparently been able to cobble together from various sources. And I wonder whether some of these are refurbished Leopard 2s that had already been damaged on the battlefronts. And I wonder also whether they're intended actually to try to make up for the actual losses of Leopard 2s that have been happening on the battlefronts. Anyway, I'm not going to get into this because, again, I'm not really familiar with all of this. Note, however, that again, Richard Kemp is not discussing a possible diplomatic settlement of the war. That still doesn't seem to be the outcome which he favours. As I discussed a couple of videos ago, there was another former British military officer who was writing for the Financial Times. I don't remember his name, but he was suggesting, very much like Richard Kemp, that what the West now needs to do is to mobilise its entire industries, its whole civilian economy, in order to build up its forces, in order to repel the Russians, and to secure for Ukraine victory in 2025. And I noticed that what this officer was talking about, the reason he thought it was so important for Ukraine to win the war, and for the West that Ukraine win the war, was no longer about Ukraine itself. It was all about NATO. He was linking, this FT article seemed to be linking the future of NATO specifically to Ukraine's success in the war. And I'm worried that this mantra is now going to start to take over. We've previously, and up to very recently, had people in the United States saying that this war was a cheap way of weakening Russia, which self-evidently, in military terms at least, it is not doing. It is increasing, as we've discussed, the size of the Russian army. It's resulting in a massive re-equipment program of the Russian army. It's accelerating Russian military production. It's not weakening Russia's economy, not in the sense that some people in the West imagine. There's another article today in the Daily Telegraph by Jeremy Warner, who says that sanctions are damaging Europe as much as Putin. And he talks about, again, Russia's resilience in the face of sanctions. The reality, as I discussed in the program yesterday, is that even as Europe struggles with an economic downturn, about which more in a moment, the Russian economy is now growing faster than the Russian leadership, the Russian government, is happy with. Apparently, despite as I said yesterday, despite the interest rate increase that took place at the beginning of, or in the middle of August, which was intended to slow things down, the economy, the Russian economy, over the course of August has actually accelerated. It is putting on speed, and there's now concerns. It might be surprising to people that some people in Russia are worried about this, that the economy might actually grow faster than 2.5% this year. The reason they're worried about that is that they're worried that this is going to bring in an inflation number which is higher than 6% by the end of the year, when the priority is to bring down inflation to 4% next year, to try and steady the economy down. But anyway, the important takeaway is that at the moment, living standards in Russia are rising. The economy is on an upward trajectory. It will certainly end this year bigger than it was in 2021. In other words, bigger than it was before the sanctions were imposed. And of course, latest reports speak about rising energy prices on the back of coordinated Saudi and Russian production cuts. Energy costs in Europe are growing again. And as Jeremy Warner discusses in his article, economic pressures in Europe especially are increasing, and he discusses about how this is creating increasing concerns within Germany, how there are some people within Germany who are now questioning the direction of policy, and perhaps a sign of the pressure, the domestic political pressure that may be growing in Germany, are some rather eccentric actions by the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, like one in which he has a poster of himself wearing an eye patch, which I have to say I do wonder what signal it's intended to convey. But anyway, coming back, the mantra before was support Ukraine because we are weakening Russia, which, as I said, isn't happening. Now I wonder whether the new mantra will be support Ukraine because NATO, the very existence and stability of NATO, is now at risk. And I would not be surprised if this mantra begins to take over in the next couple of months from the other. The one thing, as I said, is no talk so far about negotiations, at least none that we can see amongst the important Western governments. And there are some people in the West who are, especially in the United States, who are becoming concerned about this. You can see these concerns, if you read them carefully, buried in Jeremy Warner's article in the Daily Telegraph. But they also have been eloquently set out by Douglas Mackinnon in The Hill, in an article in The Hill. And Douglas Mackinnon, we learn, was once an influential US official. He was a political and communications consultant. He is a political and communications consultant who was a writer in the White House, presumably, I presume that means a speechwriter, for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And he was a former special assistant for policy and communications at the Pentagon during the last 3 years of the Bush administration. We're not clear, it doesn't make clear which Bush administration. But he is extremely critical of the lack of flexibility and imagination within the US government. He speaks about the colossal, tragic losses of the war in Ukraine. He excoriates this other mantra that, we must support Ukraine for as long as it takes. It takes to do what? To weaken Russia, to rescue NATO, to achieve a better political settlement for Ukraine. What precisely? And then he ends with some of the most powerful and eloquent and, in my opinion, sincere and truthful words that I read written by anybody in the mainstream media, and The Hill does count as mainstream media, over the course of the Ukraine war. He says that it is clear that millions of Americans are not only beginning to seriously question our involvement in and quite possibly instigation of another forever war, but are becoming sickened by the butchering of hundreds of thousands of human beings who only months before were planning for full lives with careers, children, and grandchildren. As they enjoy their lives of luxury and entitlement, maybe those advocating for Ukraine to continue the fight will tell us if 1 million dead or wounded might be the cut-off number for a new strategy. And I have to say, they're sentiments which I completely share, and I am very, very relieved to hear that they're shared by someone else who has previously held high positions in the American government. But as we say, Richard Kemp, apparently he doesn't have them that writer in the Financial Times, he isn't thinking along these terms. This is true even though Richard Kemp himself was discussing recently in one of his recent articles about how Ukraine, I think it was Richard Kemp, or was it his colleague Robert Clark, one of them, about how Ukraine is running out of men who can be sent for the war, and bluntly, any further attempt at major mobilization in Ukraine over the course of the autumn and winter is simply, to my mind, going to compound this problem. So anyway, no talk of negotiations, but it does seem that Secretary Blinken is in Kiev. Not at all clear why he's there. He apparently is coming with another $1 billion aid package. I gather that's more for economic aid, which Ukraine sorely needs, but I'm going to wait and see what that aid package is all about. But I do wonder now whether with these last reversals, with this failure to achieve this breakthrough, with whatever plans were drawn up 2 weeks ago in that meeting between General Zaluzhny and General Milley in this secret location near Lviv to revive the offensive, whether perhaps even Blinken has indeed come round, as Seymour Hersh suggests, to the inevitable need for some sort of negotiations, and whether he's come to Kiev to convey that message, at least in private. Well, we will see, but let me say again, and once more, that any talk of negotiations really has to address the fundamental issues that the Russians have been talking about: the security situation in Europe, the ultimate security position of Russia with respect to Ukraine. It's simply not realistic to think that one can hope for some kind of solution to the Ukraine crisis, to the Ukrainian conflict, unless and until the underlying problems that caused the war, the security picture in Europe, are going to be finally addressed. And John Helmer, the most experienced correspondent writing about Russian affairs, recently did a very fine article about this. He did this in the context of a article that was basically a critical review of one of the endless books that appear about Russian policy. The latest one by a man called Owen Matthews. You can read all about it in the review. The article that Helmer has written. It's called "End of the War, End of U.S. Exceptionalism," but he reiterates the point that for the Russians, one has to start looking at this from at least a Russian understanding of what their security needs are. And that unless and until this happens, peace is simply not going to result from any diplomatic initiative that doesn't address this. And he then goes on to say that, this is from Helmer, there will be no complete, that there has to be if there's going to be a negotiated peace, he makes the point that the peace will have to be, if it's going to be negotiated, the same one as was based on the various draft treaties that the Russians proposed on December 2021, and which the West rejected. And if that fails to happen, then the only outcome is going to be one where the Russians dictate peace after the military defeat of Ukraine. But whether Blinken and people like him are capable of understanding this is another matter again. Now, I say all of this, I just want to repeat this. Perhaps Blinken is going to Kiev with some agenda to get negotiations going. But it's not ultimately the Ukrainians he has to convince. It is the Russians, and I'm not sure that Blinken, in fact, I'm absolutely sure that Blinken conceptually is not able to grasp that. Now, I say that we are actually looking at a rapidly deteriorating international picture. And here there are three pieces of news that have all come together over the last couple of hours, which I think we need to understand. And when I say a deteriorating picture, I mean deteriorating picture primarily for the West, international picture primarily for the West, because all of these events taken together are pointing to a continued erosion of the US position. Firstly, we've had a huge amount more about that Huawei smartphone with its 7nm chip, the type of chip that the United States told itself China wouldn't be able to produce in quantity, and that was what all the sanctions were all about. And this has been discussed in many places, and one can sense the dismay that China has so rapidly produced a chip of this kind. And one can see, again, some attempts to reassure people, to reassure themselves. They're saying, that the Chinese have only able to produce this chip because they've managed to adapt the old manufacturing technology, which only produces 50% of the chips that are produced this way are reliable, whereas Taiwan can produce 90% of 7nm chips reliably from the new technology. There is absolutely no evidence that I know of that the Chinese are depending on older technology to produce these chips. And even if they are, 50% is probably enough for the time being. Sooner or later, if they haven't done so already, the Chinese will be able to produce chips, certainly with the same level of efficiency that Taiwan can. And the same applies to Russia as well. And this is probably even more likely true, given that the Russians and the Chinese are almost certainly cooperating in the development of this technology, which is strategically essential for both. So already we see illusions of Western technical prowess and superiority turn into dust over the space of just a few months. Then there is the fact that India has just announced that it's changing its name. Apparently it's not going to be India any longer. It's apparently intending to call itself Bharat. I am not sure why or what the significance of that is, but certainly it distances itself from the Western powers, from its former colonial masters in Britain, who are already showing signs of discomfort about this name change. I'm told that it's probably not going to be particularly popular among Bharats, or India's Muslim population. I'm not in any way able to discuss that, but, well, maybe that's true. But anyway, the fact is, the Indian government has taken this decision to change India's name on the eve of the G20 summit meeting. And surely that is a further sign that the Indian government is distancing itself from the West, is asserting again India's or Bharat's history and uniqueness and its long-term independence of the West and of its determination to pursue its own line. But then there's the third piece of information. And in some ways, this is the most, for me personally, the most disturbing one by far. Now, Ray McGovern, head of VIPS, top CIA analyst on Russian affairs, one of the most knowledgeable and erudite men that I know, and a brilliant commentator on many things. Anyway, he's referred me to an article by Theodore Postol, who is a genuine, real rocket scientist, somebody who understands missiles, rockets, and writes about them in a extremely erudite and informed way, which in my experience hardly anyone else does. Anyway, he's made a point that North Korea's latest solid fuel road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-18, looks to be almost identical to Russia's Topol-M. And he speculates, because of course one can only speculate about these things, that in fact the Hwasong-18 actually is, to all intents and purposes, a Topol-M. In other words, Russia is covertly helping North Korea with its nuclear weapons program. It's quietly accepted the fact that North Korea is now a nuclear weapons state. It is providing North Korea with the necessary technology to develop its nuclear weapons arsenal. It might even be supplying North Korea with actual missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, I want to stress I'm not able, obviously, to corroborate or discuss any of this. I am absolutely not a rocket scientist. I don't have any knowledge in this area whatsoever. Certainly, in the graphics that Postol provides, the two missiles, the Topol-M and the Hwasong-18, do look of almost identical size and configuration. And I will say that I had heard about the very great difficulty and the immense technological challenge of developing solid fuel rocket systems, and I was surprised when I heard that North Korea was fielding intercontinental ballistic missiles that used solid fuels. I was surprised at the speed with which North Korea had developed them. Of course, the Russians have developed solid fuel engines for their intercontinental ballistic missiles a long time ago. So if they are supplying this technology or even complete missiles to North Korea, then that explains the mystery. That solves the mystery. Now, I'm not saying myself that this is true. As I said, I cannot refute or corroborate what Postol says. I'm absolutely sure that the Russian government will strongly deny these claims. They will insist that under no circumstances have they supplied any of this technology to the North Koreans. But let's just speculate and assume that they have done. The United States government is now threatening North Korea with consequences if North Korea provides shells, artillery shells to Russia, which Russia can use in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying that that is indeed actually even happening, that the North Koreans are indeed supplying these shells. But what consequences can those be if the North Koreans do decide to do exactly that? How is the United States going to sanction North Korea when the United States has already sanctioned North Korea to levels that surpass the sanctions that it has imposed on any other country? What can it realistically do to North Korea beyond that which it has already done? And if the Russians are currently supplying nuclear weapons technology to the North Koreans, either in return for artillery shells or perhaps because they want to gain leverage over the US, or because they want to pressure the Japanese and the Koreans, or because they've come to some quiet understanding with China that North Korea's defenses need to be strengthened, and that China isn't obviously in a position to do that directly because it doesn't want to expose itself to secondary sanctions from the United States. But Russia, already heavily sanctioned itself, is not facing those sort of problems. Well, what can the United States do to Russia beyond what it has already done? So, who would be perhaps completely surprised if the Russians and the North Koreans are now cooperating with each other in that kind of way? Who would be surprised if Kim Jong-un and Putin are indeed going to have a meeting and do indeed decide to take their relationship further in all sorts of ways that would not be beneficial for the United States? And what, realistically, is the United States going to be able to do in response to that? Complain to Beijing? When, at a time when Xi Jinping has made it absolutely clear, as he's just shown through his decision to stay away from the G20 meeting, that he doesn't want to meet President Biden because President Biden's word is not honoured, and because the United States continues to move incrementally towards separating Taiwan from China? What is the United States going to do in this kind of situation if the worst between China and North Korea is really happening? Now, let me make it absolutely clear. I am a person who is a very strong supporter of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came into force in 1968 and which underpinned the whole process of détente. But of course, détente has collapsed. We're now in a new era of conflict between the superpowers. Is it realistic any longer to talk about détente and a nuclear non-proliferation treaty at a time when the United States is waging economic war against the Russians and cranking up to wage economic war against the Chinese and is failing against both? Of course, as I said previously, if North Korea's nuclear weapons program does develop, if its conventional military starts to grow, if North Korea does indeed start joint exercises with Russia and China, counterbalancing the joint exercises that Japan, South Korea and the United States all conduct with each other, then who would be surprised if the Japanese and the South Koreans start worrying about the strength of the US guarantee and might, for example, decide to develop nuclear weapons of their own? A further massive blow to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And can the United States realistically complain? Has it not supported the development of Britain's nuclear arsenal with American technology, despite this being perhaps a breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Has it not looked the other way, as Pakistan and, as everybody knows, Israel have developed their own nuclear weapons? Has it not in fact come to agreements with India, as India also developed its nuclear weapons? How can it seriously oppose nuclear weapons developments by Japan and South Korea if the governments of those two countries decide that that is what they want to do? And how does the United States manage those two countries if they then start to acquire nuclear arsenals? Well, I want to make it clear, I am appalled by all of these prospects. But this breakdown in relations between the great powers is leading us exactly to that point. And of course there is the further factor, which is the nature of the people that the United States is supporting. And here I'm going to just briefly touch on the situation in Africa, because there's been a brilliant article by Max Blumenthal of the Grey Zone about President Bongo of Gabon, somebody I've known very, very little about. Anyway, Max Blumenthal, who is a journalist for whom I have immense respect, has come forward and has given us the rundown, as he says, on President Bongo. Not able to corroborate any of this. I've known nothing about President Bongo and very little about President Gabon up to this point, but I have no doubt that this is true. And Max Blumenthal speaks of a president and of his father, who was also president. This is a dynasty that has ruled Gabon since 1967, of almost baroque levels of corruption. Apparently, the sister of the current president has spent around $50 million on various $50 million on holidays. The presidential palace in Gabon supposedly costs $500 million. There's vast fleets of limousines that accompany the president. There's villas in all sorts of places. There's all the usual trappings that one expects from deeply corrupt leaders and governments, and which, by the way, in parenthesis, one never sees around President Putin. And of course, we learned that President Bongo had an excellent relationship with the United States. He was apparently President Obama's friend. Now, that, again, I take entirely from Max Blumenthal. But he's got photos in which we see President Bongo and President Obama sitting together, having dinner together, attending conferences together. In fact, Max Blumenthal says that President Bongo at one time was treated as Obama's man in Africa. Well, is that the kind of person and government that we're so supportive of? We complain about corruption in so many other places, but apparently we don't see it when it's so visible in a country friendly to ourselves. As I said, the international situation for the West is deteriorating. There have been these multitudes of coups in Africa, and perhaps what Max Blumenthal tells us about President Bongo tells us why those coups are taking place. And they are clearly now expressing an obvious anti-Western orientation. India has just taken, or Bharat has just taken, an anti-Western stance, or at least made an anti-Western gesture with its sudden change of name. China is developing its advanced microchips, and there seems to be no way of stopping that. The West's leadership in this technology is starting to look like an illusion. And we have these deeply disturbing reports from Theodore Postol. I can't confirm them. I can't say that they seem inconceivable to me that the Chinese, perhaps the Russians, most plausibly, and the North Koreans have now decided that the time has come for them to renew their alliance, their old alliance, and that the Russians are now helping North Korea develop its nuclear weapons, with all that that implies for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We need urgently a rethink and a change of course. But of that, so far, there is no sign. And our leaders in the West don't seem capable of this. Chancellor Scholz comes up with stunts like his appearance with an eye patch. Andrew Coburn, a journalist whom I know little of, but I assume he is another member of the Coburn journalistic dynasty. Anyway, he's come up with a claim that apparently Western leaders were dismayed by the deterioration they found in President Biden's overall condition at the time of the Vilnius NATO summit. That's Andrew Coburn's claim. I can't confirm or refute it, but that's what Andrew Coburn said. It doesn't seem to me anyway that any of our leaders are prepared to rethink where we are and where we are going, even as the situation continues to get worse. Well, that's me for today on that bleak note. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, especially Locals and Rumble. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Also, don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, and other things. I'll be, as I said, re-engaging with X, the former Twitter. So just look out for that. I expect that will start to happen within the next few days when I've figured out a few things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.